fortunate to have with us tonight Judge Stephen Limbaugh Jr. as our speaker. And I have seen this talk, and it's outstanding. So you've got a treat in store for you unless he freezes or something. So most of you know Judge Limbaugh already. He asked me to say at least two things, and one of them is he is a past president of the State Historical Society of Missouri and is also one of the permanent trustees for the State Historical Society of Missouri. And so without further ado, I will let him talk about the Marquis de Lafayette and his visit to America in 1825.
Okay, thanks, Bill. You know, from time to time, over the decades and over the generations, Cape Girardeau has been visited by a number of famous people. But if I were to put a list together 6 months ago, I would have omitted one of those people. Have you ever heard of a fellow named Marie Joseph, Paul Yves Roche, Gilbert de Motier? Anybody heard of that guy?
Every day.
Well, Marie Joseph, Paul Yves Roche, Gilbert de Motier was in fact the Marquis de Lafayette. So, tomorrow is the 28th. A month ago, 200 years ago, the Marquis de Lafayette came by Cape Girardeau on his way to St. Louis aboard the steamboat Natchez. This was on April 28, 1825. He probably stopped down on the landing just for a couple of hours or three, probably to get supplies, probably cordwood to fuel the steamboat. He then came back by 3 days later, didn't stop, just with a wave. So, did you know that by one count there are some 600 places in the United States named after the Marquis de Lafayette? I mean, cities, counties, towns, townships, parks, schools, everything, all across the country. For instance, there is a Lafayette Park across from the White House. There's a Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. There's Lafayette, Louisiana. There's Lafayette, Indiana, and on and on. In Missouri, we have Lafayette Square in St. Louis. We have a Lafayette High School in St. Louis County. We have another Lafayette High School in St. Joseph, Missouri. There is a Lafayette County. That's the county adjacent to Jackson County, where Kansas City is. It's on I-70. It was originally named Lillard County, but in respect of Lafayette's visit to Missouri in 1825, the state legislature changed the name of Lillard County to Lafayette County. Poor Mr. Lillard. There's also Fayette, Missouri, the abbreviation of Lafayette. Fayette, Missouri is named after the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, I've looked in vain for anything in Cape Girardeau named after the Marquis de Lafayette. The only thing I could find is the Lafayette Place Apartments up on North Sprague across from the university. So that's a matter that needs to be rectified by the city fathers or powers. So why this hoorah? So surely you can recall from high school history class of not much more than Lafayette, the young Frenchman, became a comrade in arms to General Washington during the Revolutionary War. But by 1825, 49 years after the Declaration of Independence, and on the eve of our nation's 50th anniversary, Lafayette was the last of the iconic heroes of the Revolutionary War. He was the last surviving general of the Revolutionary War. He was by then 67 years old, and he was completing a grand 13-month tour of the 24 states that then comprised the United States. He was on tour at the invitation of the United States Congress and President James Monroe, the purpose of which was to celebrate for one last time his great contribution to the nation's independence and to give him a first-hand view of what the nation had become. So, but most importantly, it was the splendid prelude to our nation's golden anniversary the next year, 1826, 1776 to 1826. And it's all the more relevant for us and appropriate for us because we are on this. This should serve as a prelude to the nation's 250th anniversary next year, 1776 to 2026. And that's why it's important to revisit Lafayette's contribution and his visit here on the eve of the 50th anniversary. So, well, who was Lafayette other than what you vaguely remember from high school, and why should we venerate him? Well, first of all, who or what is a marquis? A marquis is a hereditary title of nobility that's above that of a count, but below that of a duke. So now you know. So Lafayette was born in 1757 in central France to a wealthy aristocratic family that was involved in military affairs for centuries. He, like his forebears, was reared to be a soldier. He had one ancestor who fought in the Crusades. Later on, he had another ancestor who fought alongside Joan of Arc. His own father, Colonel Michel de Lafayette, was killed in combat during what was called the 7 Years' War, the great European conflict from 1756 to 1763, the counterpart of which was the French and Indian War in the United States. Anyway, his father was killed by the British in combat during that time. Marquis de or I should say, the young Lafayette was 2 years old when his father was killed in battle, but he immediately then inherited the title of Marquis, the 2-year-old Marquis de Lafayette, okay? So by the time he was 13, though, he'd had a classical education in Paris and also an abundance of military training, so much so that at age 13, he was commissioned as an officer in the Black Musketeers. Now, I neglected to say that on his mother's side, I mentioned the military pedigree on his father's side, but on his mother's side, his great-grandfather had been the commander of the Black Musketeers under King Louis XV. Yes, it's the same Musketeers of Three Musketeers fame. That was his great-grandfather. And so here at age 13, the young Lafayette is commissioned as an officer in the Black Musketeers himself, although mainly with just ceremonial duties and just the title. Then, shortly thereafter, his mother and his grandfather died, and he inherited an absolutely immense fortune. That itself, that fortune was immensely augmented by his marriage at age 16 to his beloved Adrienne, age 14, who is much more wealthy than Lafayette was. Her father was a duke in the court of Versailles. So she was even more a part of France's nobility. So then by 1776 in the American Declaration of Independence, Lafayette becomes enamored with the revolutionaries and their cause for liberty and equality and the right of the people to rule themselves. So, of course, he had a little sympathy for the British, too, had killed his father during the 7 Years' War. So at age 19, disobeying the orders of King Louis XVI and against the wishes of his own family, he set sail for the colonies. He outfitted, he was a wealthy man, you understand, he outfitted his own ship, and he landed in the Carolinas, eventually made his way up to Philadelphia, met with the Continental Congress. They initially rejected him as just another one of these French fortune seekers, but finally they realized this guy is very wealthy and he is a part of the French nobility and they need to curry the French, so they made him at age 19 a major general in the Continental Army. Well, they didn't give him a command at the time, and he also agreed to serve at his own request without pay. So, in any event, he arrived in the summer of 1777. That's a time when the American forces were reeling from multiple defeats, and the success of the revolution was in great jeopardy. And the odds makers, surely, they betted heavily in favor of the British to squash the revolutionaries in short order. In any event, he was assigned to General Washington, who took the young Frenchman under his wing. So, within a few weeks, Lafayette had his first taste of battle when the British Admiral Lord Howe sailed from New York with an armada of 400 warships and 15,000 troops to take Philadelphia. Philadelphia was in the capital, the American capital, and it was the home of the Continental Congress. So, Washington's forces put up a valiant resistance at the Battle of Brandywine Creek, which was about 20 miles southeast of Philadelphia. They were eventually outnumbered, outflanked, and on retreat. Shot in the leg, his boot filled with blood, Lafayette nonetheless continued in the field and gallantly assisted in the successful retreat that literally saved the Continental Army from obliteration. He narrowly escaped capture himself. He was eventually loaded on a boat for transport to Philadelphia for treatment. Washington observed this, and he told his army surgeon, "Treat him as if he were my son." Well, the news of Lafayette's heroics soon spread everywhere, throughout the colonies and in France as well, and he became an instant celebrity. In today's times, his conduct on the battlefield would have won him the Congressional Medal of Honor, but they didn't have that at the time. That was only conceived in the Civil War era. But if Lafayette had been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, here's what his commendation might have said, according to one of the biographers who treats the Battle of Brandywine in much more detail. This is his commission on what should have been the Medal of Honor. The blistering fire and inexorable British advance sent the American soldiers fleeing in panic. Lafayette tried to halt their retreat. He reared his horse into the air, wheeled to the right, to the left, galloping back and forth to block the fleeing troops. Finally, he jumped off and he grabbed at men's shoulders and arms, ordering them to turn about, stand and fight. A major general in full uniform, a madman refusing to face defeat. At 6'1", he was taller than they, a knight in battle, commanding his men to hold against the enemy. Startled by a major general's presence among them in battle, the Americans halted their retreat, rallied around them, and took the enemy's charge. Sterling formed his brigade on the slight rise behind Lafayette and gave the French knight and his men covering fire, but the sheer number of British troops finally overwhelmed them, with his troops falling dead or wounded about him. Lafayette ordered them to fall back beside Sullivan's and Sterling's men, and together they stood their ground until the British were within 20 yards and forced them to flee to the safety of the woods behind. So it was then that Lafayette's aide looked down and saw blood seeping from Lafayette's boot. His aides lifted the wounded Lafayette onto his horse, and they joined the sad general retreat eastward toward Chester. In the confusion, Lafayette tried to rejoin Washington, but loss of blood left him so weak that he had to stop to have his wound bandaged and only barely escaped capture. And then at Chester, 12 miles from the battlefield, Lafayette approached the entrance to a bridge and, despite searing pain in his leg, turned his horse and blocked the disorderly retreat of the troops, ordering them to halt and reform their lines before allowing them to cross, and some degree of order was reestablished. Well, he didn't receive the Congressional Medal of Honor, but it was no small consolation that, in view of his heroics at the Brandywine Creek, the Continental Congress gave him a full division to command in combat. He's age 20. Shortly thereafter, he added on to his heroics. His wound healed, though he was still limping. He distinguished himself again, commanding 400 riflemen in a surprise attack that routed Hessian troops at the Battle of Gloucester. And then came the bitter, brutal winter of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge. locals said it was the coldest winter that they ever remembered. It was by far the coldest winter in a generation. To their great credit, both Washington and Lafayette, two of the wealthiest men in their respective countries, they declined to take leave for comfortable quarters and instead stayed with the troops, sharing the horror of their deprivations and suffering. So finally, the winter's over. Come late spring, the army regrouped. And in the meantime, France formally aligned with the Americans against the British, resulting in a long and sluggish British retreat from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, back up to New York. And in the summer of 1778, Washington's forces, led in part by Lafayette, attacked the British withdrawal and won a much needed victory at the Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey. Now, I'll get to my slides. This is Lafayette in his Major General's uniform during the Revolutionary War. Here he is, age 15. A year later, he would marry. This is his wife, Marie Adrienne. Age 14 when they married. Here he is again in his Major General's uniform. Here he is with Washington at Brandywine Creek. And here he is wounded in the leg at Brandywine Creek. Then we have Valley Forge, the bitter winter of 1777-1778, Washington and Lafayette. Here's another shot of Washington and the Marquis. And here he is again in his Major General's uniform. Well, all along, Lafayette had kept up a frequent and regular correspondence with his wife, Adrienne, and family in France, though with weeks of lag time due to the transatlantic crossing. In view of his huge success on the battlefield and his apologetic tone for leaving the family against their wishes, they now all rejoiced and fully supported his efforts, and in fact, he had become an international rock star. The luster extended to Adrienne and the family as well. In the meantime, his friendship with General Washington flourished as well. They had a natural affinity. Washington was childless. Lafayette was an orphan, and so they established a kind of father-son relationship as witnessed by all who were around them. Well, the war had settled out in the second half of 1778, which allowed Lafayette to seek an extended leave of absence and return to France in January of 1779. So on his arrival, there was the matter of the warrant for his arrest that had been issued by the king for disobeying his orders to stay in France instead of going over to the colonies back a year and a half before. But in view of the great glory that General Lafayette had brought not only to himself but also to his native France, the king had since forgiven him. So instead of remanding him to the Bastille, he was put on home detention for 1 week at the luxurious Hotel de Noël. Anyway. Well, in any event, he stayed in France for over a year to the delight of everyone, and especially his beloved Adrienne. And before his return to America in the spring of 1780, she bore him a son, George Washington Lafayette. And sure enough, General George Washington became the boy's godfather. Well, he's back in America, and the war for months goes back and forth. Finally, in early 1781, General Washington hatches a plot that would finally bring an end to the war, and Lafayette would again play a critical role. So British Lord Cornwallis had won big victories in the South, especially at the Battle of Charleston, where he defeated General Benjamin Lincoln. So Cornwallis was chasing the American forces up through North Carolina into Virginia, and he eventually hoped then to coordinate with a huge British fleet off the Chesapeake Bay. But in the spring of 1781, Lafayette's division of 1,200 soldiers was the principal American fighting force in Virginia, compared to Cornwallis's 7,000 seasoned redcoat veterans. Now, Cornwallis had no greater target than Lafayette himself, because if he could capture Lafayette, sail him back to England, and parade him in chains through the streets of London, the war would be over then and there. Cornwallis actually bragged. He said, "I shall now proceed to dislodge Lafayette from Richmond. The boy cannot escape me." But as it turned out, for the next 5 weeks, Lafayette's light infantry evaded Cornwallis's army, all the while punishing the British with hit-and-run guerrilla warfare. So eventually, Cornwallis abandoned the chase and began to move to the coast to secure, to hook up with the British fleet. Lafayette was by now reinforced with Brigadier General Anthony Wayne. Some of you Revolutionary War nerds would know him as Brigadier General Mad Anthony Wayne. He was the Brigadier General with his 1,700 soldiers, and as Cornwallis' army was making its way to the Chesapeake Bay coast, Lafayette ordered General Wayne to attack the rear. Cornwallis had figured it out, though, and had laid a trap with 4 times more men. They surrounded General Wayne's troops and nearly caused a disaster. Lafayette, learning of the debacle, ordered his troops to the scene, and he personally led a charge through the enemy lines. His white stallion was shot out from under him, but he nonetheless made his way on foot to General Wayne, and the two of them regrouped their troops to safety somehow. Wayne later reported that Lafayette that not a man in the whole detachment was more exposed than General Lafayette. So Cornwallis parks his army at Yorktown with reinforcements, and just down from Williamsburg near the Chesapeake Bay, a fleet of British warships just off the coast. And there Washington's plot became a reality. Washington's army, which had been up in New York keeping the British at bay, marched all the way down from New York into Virginia to reinforce Lafayette and Wayne. They connected then with other divisions of the Continental Army as well as several thousand French troops. And in short order, Lafayette's division and the others took the high ground and laid siege to Yorktown. The linchpin then was put in place when a second French fleet, sailed up from the Caribbean, surrounded the British fleet, and foreclosed any possible retreat or escape. So the entire episode was over in less than 3 weeks, with a relentless artillery bombardment of Yorktown, leaving Yorktown in a rubble and the British army in utter defeat. Then on October 19th in 1781, Cornwallis surrendered to Washington. This is perhaps the most iconic painting of the Revolutionary War, with the possible exception of Washington's crossing of the Delaware. Now, notice all the figures here. Here's Washington. To his immediate right is Lafayette. To Lafayette's immediate right, in the blue and red, is French General Rochambeau, who led all the French troops. Now, what happened was, at the surrender, Cornwallis faked being sick. He was humiliated, and he couldn't stand to offer his sword to General Washington, these rebels. So he appointed one of his other generals for that purpose, and this is General O'Hara, I think his name. So you see him prepared to offer the sword of surrender. But then what's going on in this picture? Lafayette's pointing to the fellow down here with his cap in his hand. That's General Benjamin Lincoln. Washington whispers to Lafayette, "No, I don't want the sword. Make him give the sword to General Lincoln, who they supposedly defeated at Charleston." So an even more extraordinary thing happened thereafter, or really as part of the same event, the same day. There were 2 lines that were established nearly a mile long. The French troops on one side, and 20 yards on the opposite were the American forces, nearly a mile long. And then to the tune of the military band playing Yankee Doodle Dandy, nearly 8,000 British troops, redcoats, marched through that gauntlet and laid down their arms. Here's a shot of it with Washington, you can see, and the troops going forth, the redcoats there. I just recently found a better painting that shows the mile-long procession. Imagine the spectacle of that. Well, the war did not formally end for another 2 years, when finally in 1783 the British, the Americans, and the French signed a peace treaty. But after Yorktown, the British, they had no more appetite for the war. No more major battles were fought. And so why is it that we still venerate the Marquis de Lafayette? As he ended his military service in the Continental Army, he was truly a hero among heroes. But it's much more than that. It's fair to say that the Revolutionary War would not have been won but for his immense, unflagging, and heartfelt commitment on and off the battlefield to the success of the great experiment that was to become the United States of America. With that, he became a worldwide symbol for the ideals of liberty and equality and the right of the people to govern themselves, all by age 24. So though the fighting was over, Lafayette would continue to advance the cause of the United States on the world stage for the rest of his life through every means possible. Now, 1784, 1 year after the treaty was signed, marked the last time that Lafayette visited the United States until his tour in 1824 and 1825, the grand tour that was 40 years later. 50 years would elapse from 1784 to his death in 1834 at age 76. And those 50 years, not including the Grand Tour of America, were ever more remarkable. But that's not so much the focus of this presentation, except to say that there's far much to say about those 50 years after the Revolution, except for the brief summary that I'll try to share with you. So, by the late 1780s, there was much agitation against the crown. France's economy was tanking. There was great poverty among the proletarian class, so much so that the people rose up in defiance. Lafayette himself was one of the key leaders of the revolt, of the French Revolution. He was arguing for a constitutional monarchy as opposed to the divine right of kings. And despite being the very embodiment of the ideals of liberty and equality and of government by the people, he still somehow maintained the best relations with the aristocracy and the nobility in France. So, July 1789, he collaborated with none other than Thomas Jefferson, who was then the equivalent of the ambassador to France from the United States, to draft what was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which served as the French equivalent of the American preamble to the United States Constitution. Their aim, again, was not to do away with the crown, but was to give the power of governance to the people, again, a constitutional monarchy. Then, July 14th, 1789, with their tacit approval, Lafayette and Jefferson witnessed the storming of the Bastille in Paris, which was the horrific prison that was a grave symbol of the monarchy's abuses. And it was the beginning of the French Revolution. And that same day, Lafayette, the hero of the American Revolution, he was appointed as commander of the French National Guard to bring stability and maintain order throughout the city of Paris. Not only that, but throughout the entirety of the country of France. He was the equivalent of the commanding officer of all of the military operations in France. At some point, he also obtained the key to the Bastille, and he sent it to President George Washington, then President George Washington, as proof of the success of the revolution is at that time too that Lafayette is the one who designed the tricolor blue, white, and red flag of France. It still flies today, blue for liberty, white for equality, and red for fraternity. This is one of hundreds of depictions of the storming of the Bastille. I just picked the first one that showed up. Here he is as the commander of the French National Guard. So, what happened next is that over the next 2 years, with fits and starts, the French Revolution proceeded. Lafayette serving all the way as the moderating influence between the pro-monarchy and the pro-citizen extremes. Then in 1792, the crazies took over. Jacobins, they were called. And they introduced the Reign of Terror that you've heard about, beheading Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and literally thousands of other aristocrats, and as well as regular folks too. So at the beginning of the terror, Lafayette was called on to become both the military and political leader of France, as he was deemed to be the only person with enough clout to bring a peace. But it was not to be. The crazies put out a warrant for his arrest, and he narrowly escaped the guillotine himself, only to be exiled and imprisoned by the Austrians, who were monarchists, who were upset at Lafayette's earlier call for freedom from the monarchy. So, back at Lagrange, the family ancestral home. Well, first of all, this is Lafayette arrested and put in prison. Here is the Lafayette's ancestral home called Lagrange, Chateau de Lagrange. Nice place. Here's another shot of Lagrange. So back at Lagrange, Adrienne and the kids were finally hunted down themselves. Adrienne's mother, grandmother, and sister were all beheaded. By an act of sublime providence, the new American envoy to France, and later the American president, and Lafayette's close friend from battle in the Revolutionary War, was James Monroe. He interceded to save Adrienne from the same fate, but she too was imprisoned. For some 5 years, Gilbert and Adrienne were imprisoned, finally arriving at the same prison in Austria for the last 2 years. Finally, then, in 1797, the young upstart Napoleon shows up. Though no fan of Lafayette, he secures their release. I'm not making this up. Eventually, Lafayette and his family would make it back to Lagrange. Restitution would be made for much of the property. In 1803, you remember what happened in 1803. It was the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson got Congress to pay $15 million to Napoleon so Napoleon could finance his wars, and the United States got the Louisiana Territory, which basically doubled the geographic size of the United States at the time. So Jefferson said, well, what am I going to do with that? He writes to Lafayette. Lafayette, would you come back over to the United States and be the governor of the Louisiana Territory for us? Well, he was in no position to do that at the time. His wife was not well, and so he declined. He was not about to leave his family, and sadly, his beloved Adrienne died in 1807 at age 48, and somewhat due to the privation she suffered while imprisoned. So Lafayette turned back to handling his affairs as a gentleman farmer. He sat out much of the Napoleonic regime, becoming quite critical of the emperor, but his object was to make Lagrange in something of a Mount Vernon in France. And he was very successful financially at doing that. Much the same way that George Washington was successful, except without slaves. As a matter of fact, Lafayette he railed against the scourge of slavery his entire life. So, We'll fast forward then to 1824 and the invitation for one final visit to America. Surely there's no better way to kick off the 50th anniversary celebration than to host the Marquis de Lafayette, General Lafayette, guest of the nation. He was he was accompanied by his son, George Washington Lafayette, along with his secretary, Auguste Levasseur, and a valet, Bastien. Everybody needs a valet, of course. And over the 13 months, they visited each of the nation's 24 states. Fortunately, Levasseur, the secretary, documented the entire trip with great detail, compiling a daily journal that ran to nearly 600 pages, which I have here translated into English. Some of you have heard the book Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. That was a travelogue written 10 years later in 1835, which documented and it was a commentary on the political, social, and cultural aspects of the new nation. This book did the same thing 10 years before as kind of a precursor to what de Tocqueville wrote. So, in any event, on August 16, 1824, Lafayette's ship arrives in New York Harbor, and it's escorted by a flotilla of ships filled with dignitaries. Here's a shot of it. Whoops. That's his wife before she was imprisoned. Oh, this is him all decked out for his trip to the United States in 1824. And this is what he encountered on his arrival at New York Harbor. There were 80,000 people, 80,000 New Yorkers lined up to see this great man, or just to get near enough to get a glimpse of the Marquis de Lafayette. When he landed, there was a military procession. There were several soldiers from the Revolutionary War that he stopped and paused to talk with. But then they finally loaded him up in a beautiful carriage drawn by 4 white horses and led him all the way to City Hall, a mile or so away. The cannons were booming, church bells ringing. Thousands of people, 80,000 people, lined the streets to greet this great man. There were a whirlwind over the next few days of balls and dinners and receptions. It was a veritable spectacle, not only in New York, but at every stop during his tour. Thousands of people, hundreds and thousands of people would come by to see him. Balls, dinners, receptions, always at each visit, he would make time, set out several hours in the day to meet the ordinary folk in the town, and especially those who might have been alive at the time of the Revolutionary War. So anyway, he's several days in New York. Then he goes up to see John Adams in Boston. John Adams at that time was failing. He was infirm, couldn't get out of the house. He was not quite on his deathbed, but he had spent a lot of time in Boston and then up through New England as well. Then he comes back down through New York and he heads down to Philadelphia. And this is the reception he got in Philadelphia. They even erected an arch, a grand arch. See the Lafayette Arch? So this is how it was at every major city. Thousands of folks greeted the great general. Balls, dinners, receptions, cannons booming, church bells ringing. So while in Pennsylvania, he goes to Yorktown, he goes to Brandywine Creek, and then he goes down to Washington, D.C. Now, here is the map of the 24 states at the time of his visit. You can see all that unorganized territory, combined Missouri, Arkansas, unorganized territory. All that was Louisiana Purchase, of course. So here is the route of his travels. So as I said, he goes back to New York, down to Philadelphia, visits the battlefields. Then he goes to Washington, where he is the same events, the spectacles happen. Thousands of people greet him, parades, and he meets with Congress. He spent several days in Washington, D.C., but the main thing he wants to do there is to get down to Mount Vernon. He goes to Mount Vernon, right outside of Washington, D.C., and he finds that they still have the key to the Bastille that he had sent to George Washington at the first day of the Revolutionary War. And then he goes into the tomb of Martha Washington and George Washington. He says, I'm going by myself. And he spends an hour or so there. And when he comes out of the tomb, his face is covered with tears. So anyway, from Washington, he goes down to Yorktown. From Yorktown, he goes through the Carolinas. He goes to the battlefields at Camden and Charleston, then makes his way across Georgia and Alabama and down to Mobile. Now, he's 67 years old. And he's beat. I mean, the carriage rides, there was no interstate highways. The carriage rides across Alabama and South Carolina, Georgia, they left him flat out exhausted. But finally, he got some relief. In Mobile, they had one of the finest steamboats anywhere outfitted for him. It was called the Natchez. It was a luxurious steamboat in those days. They had a huge ornate lobby like the lobby of a grand hotel. They had rich oriental rugs, oil painting, chandeliers, a top chef, and a large staff of butlers and maids. And so finally he got to relax. So after a few days in Mobile, they circle around to New Orleans. He spends a lot of time in New Orleans, goes to the battlefield where Andrew Jackson won the big victory in the War of 1812. Several days there, then up to Baton Rouge, and then from Baton Rouge up to Natchez. And then he's on his way to St. Louis, you see. So Levasseur says in his journal that on withdrawing from Natchez, we parted from the civilized world, so to speak. So everything north of Natchez was still kind of wilderness on both sides of the Mississippi River. The settlements were sparse. Even in Missouri, once you got up as far north of Missouri, the largest town was St. Louis, of course. It had fewer than 6,000 citizens. The next largest town, there were no cities, in Missouri was St. Genevieve that had about 1,500. Franklin, Missouri had a little over 1,000. There were just 4 other towns in Missouri that had more than 500 people. Potosi, St. Charles, Jackson, and Cape Girardeau. That was it. In any event, they finally arrive here in Cape Girardeau on the landing, April 28th, 1825. I regret to say that Cape Girardeau's not too impressive at the time. Here is what we found out about Lafayette's visit and what prompted us to look into the history of this visit more. This is the article from 100 years after Lafayette's trip from the Southeast Missourian. Sharon Sanders, the historian at the Missourian, found this for us. And it's written undoubtedly by Alan Hinchy, who was the editor at the time and a amateur historian. But they maintain that Lafayette stopped here, and actually we have some corroboration from the journal, Lavasseur's journal. Here's what he says. As one leaves the mouth of the Ohio, the appearance of the banks of the Mississippi changes completely. The shores are higher and also offer a greater number of dwelling places. 40 miles from the confluence stand nearly opposite each other Cape Girardeau and Cape Lacroix, each named in this matter by the French. And he says, there is now on Cape Girardeau a small town recently founded which already has begun to prosper. That's about all that there is. So did you hear that he mentioned a Cape Lacroix in addition to Cape Girardeau? Well, our friend Bill Edelman has done the research on it. It's kind of inconclusive, but he's identified Cape Lacroix on a map from 1718, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly where it was, but it was slightly below Cape Girardeau, opposite each other. That's why Levasseur mentioned it that way. It was probably just north of what the Port Authority, or it could be, you know, right below the bridge is this turn. It's called Gray's Point. It could have been at Gray's Point, but in any event, there had been a little small settlement, a hamlet at one point. It was all gone by 1825. So, unfortunately, as I say, there's not much to report about Cape Girardeau. The county had 5,700 people, 930 of whom were slaves. Nearly everyone was rural. Nobody lived in the cities hardly. The only big news of the time in 1824 and 1825 was that Daniel Steinbeck, which is Louis Larmer's son-in-law, he died in 1825, and he had owned a good part of what was then Cape Girardeau proper, and his estate was so messed up they were not able to settle it for another 20 years or so. The other big news in Cape Girardeau County was that the First Circuit judge, a fellow named Richard S. Thomas, he got himself impeached for misdeeds in office, and he was replaced by a fellow named John Dillard Cook. I've spoken about John Dillard Cook here before. He has ancestors or descendants here too. Jerry Ford, Walter Joe Ford. John Dillard Cook, who took the places, the circuit judge was their great-great-great-grandfather. That's all that was going on. There was just nothing. There's no newspaper accounts. There's no diaries, no journals. There's just nothing to report on for probably 5 or 10 years either way from 1825. There's only one known drawing, and this is a double drawing, and it was taken, the drawing was made by another Frenchman who was going up and down the Mississippi River drawing the settlements. And this is a upgrade from by Mark Farmer in 1992. He put these two drawings together. Now you can see on the top one, that is Broadway Hill. Going right below would be Main Street, and all the field there, that would be the parking lot on the northwest corner of Broadway and Main Street today. And the top left where that building is, the white building, that's where Spanish Street intersected. And then you can see the bluffs over here where Fort A was. That's where Marcia and I live. And then down below is the other picture. This is taken from Courthouse Park. There was no courthouse there until 1853, but as you can see, the trees have been stripped off, and there was a commanding view of the river. You see the steamboats down there, and you see a few buildings down below. The one on the far right is called the Ellis Tavern. I mean, Cape Girardeau was a rough place still. It was a rough, rowdy river town. There were no churches, quite a few taverns. So, anyway, the Marquis was here just for a cup of coffee and to get some cordwood for the boat. So they take off from Cape Girardeau and make their way the same day all the way up to Carondelet, where they just below St. Louis, where they spent the night. That leads me to mention that these steamboats made every passage so much easier. Before the time of steamboats, it was 3 to 4 months from New Orleans to St. Louis, and it was a brutal, brutal passage. But with the steamboats, it was 10 days. So they were able to make it to Carondelet the same day on the 28th of April. The next morning, the entire town of St. Louis came out. More than 5,000 people greeted Lafayette and his entourage on the banks of the Mississippi. And they had a parade that took him straight over to the home and museum of William Clark. William and Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. William and Clark had been the territorial governor until statehood in 1821. He was the most famous person in all of Missouri. But they really wanted, Lafayette really wanted to see William Clark because he was interested in all of the history that Clark had put together, the Indians and the flora and fauna of this wilderness here. He was especially intrigued by the bears. Let me just read this one little passage to you. It's just delightful, and it shows what an interesting read Monsieur Levasseur. He says this is when they're visiting William Clark's place. Among the objects that commonly serve as dress for Indian hunters, collars made of claws of a prodigious size caught our attention. The claws come, said Mr. Clark, from the most frightening of the animals on the American continent, the grizzly bears of the Missouri, whose ferocious intelligence increases the terror which their size and their prodigious strength inspire. The bears of this species join together, 10 or 12 in number, sometimes more, to hunt and share their prey in common. Man is their game of choice. And when they fall upon his tracks, they hunt him down with barks like our hounds chasing a rabbit, and it is difficult for a man to escape the persistence of their pursuit. This animal is altogether unknown in Europe, even in the most magnificent menageries, zoos they called them. The collection of natural history of London possesses only one claw, and they consider a great rarity. So then Levasseur drops a footnote. Since his return to France, General Lafayette has received a young Missouri bear, which was sent to him by Governor Clark. He presented it to the professors at the Botanical Garden, who have placed it in the menagerie where the public can now see it. So, in any event, they had to drag Lafayette away from William Clark's home and museum because they had dinners and balls, and it was just another magnificent event, as was similar to all the others, except that St. Louis was still wilderness. I'll just read another little bit from Levasseur. So, General Lafayette ended by toasting the health of the venerable patriarch, that is Choteau, who in 1763 founded the city of St. Louis, and immediately after we left the table to go to the ball, where we found the most brilliant and most numerous company which was ever assembled, they say, on the western shore of the Mississippi. The luster of the decorations of the hall and the elegance of the ladies who filled it made us forget entirely that we were at the entrance to a wilderness. But there was one other thing that struck Lafayette more than any other that, during his time in St. Louis, and that was at the ball. There was an apparition coming toward him, and it seemed to him, this must be the ghost of my dear friend, Alexander Hamilton. It was Hamilton's son, and they embraced each other. Well, anyway, the next day, he takes leave of St. Louis. They go back downriver, spend a day in Kaskaskia, of all places. Kaskaskia had been the first capital of the state of Illinois. So they wind their way around. Oh, by the way, St. Louis did this upright. About 6 weeks ago, in preparation for his visit to St. Louis, the Post-Dispatch and all the history buffs and the Les Amis organization in St. Louis put together a big ball, and here is their feature for it, the Lafayette being greeted by the citizens. And so indeed they had a big ball at the mansion of Pierre Choteau's granddaughter. That would have been an interesting event. So anyway, we're back to the tour. So he comes back down, as you can see, to the mouth of the Ohio. He takes the Ohio up to the Cumberland River, goes down to the Cumberland to visit Andrew Jackson at Nashville, at the Hermitage. Spends several days with Jackson. Then back up to the Ohio. He goes to Louisville, to Cincinnati, up to Pittsburgh, and then, as you can see, up to Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and then he comes back over to the East Coast. He visits Boston one last time. He gets there in time for the dedication of the monument to commemorate the Battle of Bunker Hill, the first major battle of the Revolutionary War. So on the 17th of June in 1825, Lafayette lays the cornerstone at the monument. And it was this wonderful patriotic event, you know, like all the others. It's parades, all in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. As Lafayette and his son George Washington Lafayette were leaving, they scoop up a sack full of soil from the battlefield of Bunker Hill to take back with them to France. They meet one last time with John Adams, who is not on his deathbed yet, but he is very infirm. He's an invalid. He's on his last legs, but they do meet one last time. Then he comes back down to New York, back to Philadelphia, back to Washington, where he is greeted by the new President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son. Then he goes down to, and I should have mentioned this before, down to Monticello to see Jefferson one last time. He'd been at Monticello at the same time he was, or shortly after he visited Mount Vernon. At Monticello, they had one final dinner. And it was, wouldn't you like to have been invited to this dinner? They had the third President of the United States, Jefferson. They had the fourth President of the United States, Madison. They had the fifth President of the United States, James Monroe, and the Marquis de Lafayette. They all dined together one last time. So he makes his way back up to Washington, D.C., where John Quincy Adams wines and dines him again. And finally, in September 1825, he sets sail back to France, courtesy of the United States Navy, aboard its newest frigate, aptly named the Brandywine. In its wake was a nation just awash in patriotic fervor. 24 days later, he is back in France. He arrives at Chateau de la Grange, hoping to live out the rest of his life in peace and prosperity and tranquility with family and friends. So 9 months later, after he gets back, it's the 4th of July celebration. He finds out what happened about a month later because of the transatlantic crossing. So he finds out that the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary, 1826 was not only a day of celebration, it was a day of mourning. You see, Adams was 89, Jefferson was 83. They had outlived all but one of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. The second President of the United States, the third President of the United States. At one time they were the fast friends. Later on in life they were bitter enemies. And towards the end of life they became fast friends again. But they had one goal together. And that was they were going to see the 4th of July. They had been on their deathbeds for weeks. They had beaten the grave time and again, all to see the 4th of July. And so finally, as the day approached, both of them, 555 miles away from each other, they willed themselves to live to see the 4th of July. And on that day, they willed themselves to die. The most extraordinary day in American history, in my mind. So, back in France, Lafayette hears the news, he celebrates and he mourns along with all the Americans. His life was not going to be easy the rest of the time. You see, in 1830 there was yet another French Revolution. By then, Napoleon was out and they had reinstated the monarchy. There was a king called Charles X who was no good. The people rose up against him. And who should they enlist to lead the revolution but the 73-year-old Marquis de Lafayette? They made him again. They made Lafayette at age 73 the commander of the French national forces. He did not want another fight like the French Revolution that occurred in the 1790s. So he had enough clout that he was able to negotiate the abdication of Charles X instead of a military coup. He was successful at that. Then they, in place of Charles X, they put in a fellow named Louis Philippe. They called him the citizen king because he didn't wear all the emoluments and the trappings of the big kings. But Louis Philippe was not much better. 2 years later, in 1832, there was yet another uprising. And y'all are familiar with this one because you've seen Les Miserables, you've either read Victor Hugo's novel, Les Miserables, or surely you've seen the musical. So you've seen the musical, right, of Les Miserables? Well, you remember the climactic scene. The climactic scene was when the uprising and all of the rebels and the common folks, they went to the barricades. You remember that song that is, do you hear the people sing? Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, the king's folks put down the uprising in fairly short order, just a few days. But Lafayette was there. He's 74 years old now. Here's back at La Grange. We ought to go there sometime just to visit. And here it is from Les Miserables. Remember the scene? Lafayette was there, age 74. So finally, here he is at 75 in repose at La Grange, and he's had enough. He finally passes the next year, age 76 in 1834, surrounded by family and friends. Huge funeral procession to the tiny little private cemetery in Paris, where he is buried next to his beloved wife, Adrienne. Thousands of people, of course, join in the parade to the small cemetery, but nobody could get in except for the family. But at the very conclusion of the graveside service, George Washington Lafayette takes the soil from Bunker Hill and spreads it across the grave of the tomb of his father. All right, fast forward 83 years. We're now 1917. It's the midst of World War I. World War I has become a stalemate. It is a bloodbath of trench warfare, hellish war of attrition. Already some 700,000 soldiers have been killed. Many millions of people, soldiers and citizens alike, have been wounded. The front lines are just 80 miles or so from Paris. It's a standstill until the Americans join the war in April of 1917. So they organize what's called the American Expeditionary Force, led by our fellow Missourian General John J. Blackjack Pershing. He arrives with the first wave in late June of 1917. 14,000 soldiers land on the banks of the Atlantic in France. A year later, in 1918, there would be 1 million American soldiers, Yankees, doughboys they call them, and they would fight on French soil and turn the tide of the war against the Germans and in favor of the British and the French. So Pershing lands his first wave of 14,000 troops in late June. He thinks he should make a statement about the Americans' presence. So he organizes a parade. He assigns a battalion of the U.S. soldiers for that purpose, along with a military band. The parade starts at the very heart of Paris, called Les Invalides, the tomb of Napoleon. And the parade winds its way through the streets of Paris, past the old Bastille, for several miles. And all along the way, thousands of joyful French citizens swarm the parade. Women and children grab the arms of the American soldiers and march down with them. Flowers pour out from every window and balcony, so much so that Pershing in his later memoirs said it was as if the column was a moving flower garden. And so finally, after several miles, they reach the destination. The destination, of course, was the tomb of Lafayette. And the date? You asked the date? The 4th of July, 1917. So, as the dignitaries and the politicians and the soldiers gathered together, pressed in that small cemetery, here's a shot of it. This is General Pershing in the middle. And the time came for the Americans to give an address, and General Pershing calls on a Colonel Stanton for that purpose. And Stanton delivers this wonderfully spirited, patriotic address that encourages everyone that the war can be won now that the Americans are here. And at the very conclusion of the address, Colonel Stanton turns toward the tomb of Lafayette for the final last few words. The next day, the Paris newspapers, having translated those last few words into several versions of the French, they posted them on their front page headlines. Lafayette, nous voilà. Lafayette, nous sommes là. Lafayette, nous sommes ici. All to say, Lafayette, we are here. And all to say, Lafayette, we have come to repay our debt to you. Thank you all.
Anyone have any questions?
Was Lafayette a Mason?
Yes. Yes. How'd you know?
All the rest of them were.
Yeah, that's right. Any questions?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Excellent speech.
If you have any other questions later, just let me know. I know more than anybody around here about Lafayette now.
Very obvious.
Okay. All right. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Awesome.
Yeah.